Hello and welcome to part 3 of making Navia from Genshin Impact. In this video we'll be making all the skirt layers and the bow. I used a pattern that included pretty much everything you really needed to make this outfit. I have included the link below if you're interested in making your own Navia cosplay too. As the patterns only came in one size, I did have to alter the yellow skirt layers and the black skirt layers. It was only those two pieces that I had to alter. I didn't actually have to alter any of the other pieces. Anyway, let's start with making the skirt layers. To start off, I primed the 3D prints with a 50-50 mixture of acetone and wood filler. I used a weeder tool to dig out the unwanted paste from the 3D print details. For this process, I used rough sandpaper, smooth sandpaper to remove the rough edges, a brush to remove dust, and a weeder to remove the coatings out of engravings. I also used a buffer and polisher tool to help smooth the surfaces. After applying the acetone wood filler coats, I then hung the prints to dry. I sprayed 2 coats of paint primer onto the 3D prints. I spray painted the prints gold, and once the first coat was dry, I spray painted a second coat of gold paint. I then painted black paint to add details to the 3D prints. I painted the details of the gem encasing print and also the engravings of the arrow-like prints too. And here is what the prints turned out after painting. I was really happy with how they turned out. After sanding and smoothing the 3D printed gem, I cast a silicone mould. After the moulds had set, I poured blue dyed resin into the mould and let the resin set for 24 hours. After the resin had set, I sanded the blue gem. There were a few bubbles which the resin dust had filled in. Unfortunately, I could not get all the dust out, so I moved on and sprayed 2 layers of clear gloss onto the gems. After using the alcohol marker on the resin, here is what the gem looked like. You can see the markings close up, but it now looks a lot better from the distance. I then used mirror paper as the backings to the gem pieces and used resin glue to hold it in place. I attached the dangly pieces together using 10mm jump rings. Before I could begin making the skirt, I made a mock-up pieces to simulate what the skirt would look like. I made some pattern adjustments, such as lengthening and widening the yellow and black skirt pieces. I was much more happy with the adjustments in the second mock-up. For making the yellow skirt layers, I traced the yellow skirt pattern onto the buckram. This is the first time I ever used buckram before, so I learnt a lot researching about it. For those who also don't know much about it, buckram is a cotton or linen open weave that is soaked in starch to provide firmness. It's used to provide structure, support, and shape to garments. It is actually commonly used in curtain headers, where it prevents the fabric from sagging and creates sharp pleats. It's also used in hat making as well as other items such as tote bags and purses, and in this case we are using it to provide stiffness for the yellow skirt layer, which is really cool to use it in that way. I ironed the buckram to remove the curl from when it was rolled. I initially basted the buckram onto the fabric. I then later found out this method was definitely not going to work when putting this together. I then made a pattern for the yellow ruffles. I measured the length on the yellow skirt piece, then multiplied it by 2.5. The final measurement of this pattern piece ended up being over 3 meters. I sewed right sides together and sewed the short edges closed, just like what I did with the side hip pieces. I folded the ruffle piece and ironed the fold flat. I put 2 gathering stitches along the open edge of the fabric. I then ironed over the long fabric strip a second time. I then began the process of gathering and pleating the satin fabric. This took a lot of time as I had to get both the gathered pleats symmetrical in length, the number of pleats, the same number of pleats, as well as mirroring the placement on both the yellow skirt pieces. Just look at how crisp these gathered pleats are. For the pin tuck trim, I cut out a long strip of fabric, ironed a crease, then pinned the crease down as shown. I ironed another crease in place. After this, I folded both the raw edges behind and ironed flat. I then top stitched the fold down. I also ironed over the trim again. This is what the top stitch looks like so far on the trim. I pinned the folded raw edges, then top stitched this down too. Here is the almost finished version of the pin tuck trim. I did another top stitch over the other fold. I then sneakily secured the fold at the back by sewing over a previous top stitch. I then started making a pattern for the interfacing. The interfacing will be ironed on to provide stability onto the gathered pleats once they are sewn on. I pinned both interfacing pieces on the fabric. I think it's symmetrical. Obviously looking at taking that off for the seam allowance. I wanted to spend some time outside sewing, so I had this table set up ready to go. However, I had so many bees wanting to come and say hi. Every time we got one away, another came along, so I put all the yellow honey looking fabric away for another time. I hand basted the pleats and pin tuck trim on, then sewed over the top stitching to secure the gathered pleats and trim. I then sewed the trim and pleats down on the other side of the skirt. I sewed the gathered pleat layer to the buckram basted satin layer with wrong sides together. For the pleats, I pinned them so as they would be tucked into the seam allowance. I was able to turn the yellow skirt right sides out. You can't really see it in the video, but the buckram did not want to sit flat at the seam allowance. I was not happy with how the yellow skirt looked. So I unpicked the entire skirt. I went back to the cutting table and thought of a different way to put the buckram into the yellow skirt. I cut out the seam allowance of the buckram as I was now planning to make this as an insert instead. I sewed the front and back yellow skirt pieces together. I carefully inserted the buckram layer into the satin pieces. I trimmed off extra buckram so as I could hand stitch the long edge closed with enough seam allowance. Encasing the corner piece was especially challenging to do, so I sewed the fabric corner with my sewing machine. I pinned the seam allowance on the long edge closed, then ironed the open seam flat. When I was flipping the other side of the skirt out, I actually found this really difficult to do compared to the first. I had to secure the black layer of fabric and buckram using pins at the top edge and bottom corner to keep the buckram still. Then I carefully flipped it out. I used clips to hold the fabric and buckram edge together. I was then able to remove the pins. I trimmed a bit more of the buckram so as I could fold the seam allowance over the buckram. I sewed the corner of the yellow skirt piece, trimmed the seam allowance, then flipped the corner bit right sides out. After I was able to encase the buckram, I used clips to hold the seam closed. After ironing the seams flat, I hand sewed a slip stitch from one side of the skirt to the other side of the skirt. It was so great to see the skirt slowly coming together. I stitched, then pinned a strip of gold 4-way stretch faux leather onto the top opening of the skirt. I then stitched in the ditch to close the skirt opening. Off camera, I made one skirt piece folded in similar spots to Navia and mirrored the pleats on the other side of the skirt. I actually had to put some physical effort into this. The buckram is quite sturdy and it needs some effort to bend into place. Despite folding and ironing this into place, I found the fabric wanted to move from the pleats, so I hand sewed at different spots to keep the fabric in place. I also hand sewed the pleats near the waistline of the skirt to keep the pleats in place too. For the black skirt layer, I used my cry cut to cut out a mirrored faux leather details and an identical piece from glitter heat transfer vinyl. I carefully cut and weeded all the unwanted pieces from the faux leather. I then went along with my small scissors to neaten the edges. I also weeded out the unwanted pieces from the glitter heat transfer vinyl. I applied the glitter vinyl to the faux leather using a low temperature on my mini iron. Once the pieces were cool, I carefully pulled away the plastic from the vinyl. With my cry cut, I cut out glitter HTV vinyl for the pretty detail that is shown on the black skirt layer. I thoroughly measured the glitter vinyl from all the edges to prevent it getting caught in the seam allowance. I measured along the long edge to ensure the vinyl was parallel to the edge and ironed it down onto the right side of the interface velvet layer. Once the vinyl cooled, I carefully pulled away the plastic from the vinyl. When I was applying the faux leather to the black velvet layer, it was a little tricky because I was matching a concave edge to a convex edge. However, once it was sewn and flipped right sides out, it will sit very nicely. I base stitched the leather piece onto the black velvet piece and did the same for the mirrored piece too. This was quite tricky doing this as the leather was very slippery and the heat transfer vinyl was starting to slip off the leather too. A base hand stitch would have been very helpful, however I got there in the end with my sewing machine. I then sewed the interface and non-interface velvet pieces right sides together. I clipped all the loose ends, then I trimmed the seam allowance and clipped the curves, then turned the velvet pieces right sides out. For the smocking detail, I sewed a long piece of velvet fabric with a round end. I trimmed and clipped the curves before turning the long piece right sides out. I ironed the velvet piece flat. It was very fiddly. Also, please don't do what I did just here. I ironed velvet without a pressing cloth, which ruins the pile. So when ironing velvet, please make sure you use a pressing cloth. On the black skirt layer, I ironed all the edges flat. I unpicked along the straight edge of this skirt, as trimming and clipping the curved hip edge is a lot easier than hand sewing a curved edge. I trimmed the seam allowances and clipped the edges. Once I did this to both pieces, I flipped the pieces right sides out. After ironing the pieces flat, I folded the layers until I was happy with the fold placing and symmetry. It was then time to work on the smocking. I used pins to mark the alternating folds and gathered markings. This smocking detail was so confusing. It took me so long to get my head around it. I even asked Anaelic a few times on how to do it too. Anyway, she was able to help me eventually understand it. What I did for the gather, I made 2 folds like this, then stitched in place. I picked up the fold line and pulled it up to where the gather stitch is. I hand sewed the fold at the front, as well as securing the fold at the back. I repeated these steps until the end of the velvet strip. To attach the smocking detail, I clipped onto the velvet skirt layer, then hand sewed it down. I used pliers to assist pulling the needle through the thick velvet layers. For each smocking pleat, I first loosely attached 1 big half pearl with 2 little half pearls and adjusted as needed to get a placement I was happy with. Once all pearls were placed, I used a small amount of fabric glue to secure the pearls to the smocking fabric. Here is what the finished velvet skirt layer looks like. For the side pieces, I top stitched a navy satin trim onto the side hip piece. After sewing, I ripped off the tracing paper from the back of each side hip piece. I used this paper to reduce the fabric slipping around whilst I was sewing with my sewing machine. I made a pattern for the white satin flowy pleats by measuring the length of the curved edge of the velvet side hip piece, and I multiplied the total length by 2.5 and added a 1 cm seam allowance around the pattern. I pinned the pattern onto a scrap piece of white satin, then cut out the fabric using my rotary cutter. I initially sewed this by sewing straight down the folded satin piece. After I finished sewing the gather stitches, I realised sewing the short edges and corner, then flipping it right sides out would be a lot easier for later. After unpicking, I sewed just the short edge to the corner. I trimmed the seam allowance and ironed the piece flat. then sewed a gathering stitch along the open edge. I then pleated the gathered satin until it was evenly spread and within the seam allowance of the black velvet pieces. I applied clips and pins to secure the pleats. I basted the gathered pleats in place. After basting, I generously pinned the white satin along the black velvet edge. I also checked the white satin edges were far enough from the black velvet seam allowance. I took my time with sewing and slowly basted the white pleats on the black velvet fabric. I then sewed both velvet pieces together with the white satin fabric sandwiched between the two layers. I left some pins in the white satin to prevent accidentally sewing the white satin on the corner edges of the seam allowance. I trimmed the seam allowances, clipped the curves, and turned the velvet pieces right sides out. And here is what the finished side velvet piece looks like. I also added snap-on clips to the side hip pieces to attach the 3D prints I worked on earlier. I hand sewed these really big snap-on clips that were strong enough to secure the yellow skirt onto the white skirt. I had to use these clips because the yellow skirt was so heavy. I then hand sewed snap-on clips connecting the black skirt piece onto the yellow skirt piece. And this is what both the yellow and black skirt pieces look like together. I was very happy with how it was starting to turn out. After finishing the skirt layers, I began assembling the bow and bow tail patterns together. I traced the patterns onto craft paper and cut all the copied pattern piece out. This ended up being a lot of pattern pieces for just the bow and bow tails. I rolled out black velvet upholstery fabric, then cut out 4 pieces to make the back bow. I also cut out 2 interfacing pieces for the back bow too. I also cut a small strip of velvet fabric for the strip around the bow. I then ironed the interfacing pieces onto 2 bow fabric cutouts. For the pretty gold details on the bow, I used my cry cut to cut out 2 gold glitter heat transfer vinyl pieces. I peeled off the excess gold vinyl to reveal the pretty detail. I also printed out the black detail that is placed within the gold detail. I then ironed on the gold heat transfer vinyl onto the black velvet piece. Then I peeled it off. It was so satisfying peeling it off and seeing the pretty glitter attached onto the velvet. For the black detail, I tried to do some strategic placements for my cry cut to cut out the details. I wanted to save some vinyl by printing lots of small components compared to lots of big components. I'm not sure if I actually saved vinyl or not with this. I think I saved a tiny bit and used a lot of brain power to play Tetris on the cry cut cutting layout instead. Anyway, I then ironed on the black vinyl on top of the gold vinyl. I applied 1 strip at a time. I applied the long middle layer, then the top sides, then the bottom sides, and lastly I applied the middle one on. And here is what the finished bow piece with all the vinyl looks like. I cut out these pretty trims out of faux leather, then cut out the same shapes out of glitter HTV. I then peeled the unwanted pieces away. I then ironed the glitter onto the soft fur side of the faux leather. I clipped the glitter leather onto the curved side of the bow and then sewed it on. I put the bow pieces right sides together and clipped in place. I sewed each bow pieces right sides together. I stuffed each bow piece with 2 layers of foam. This was actually quite difficult because you really had to stuff it in there. I sewed the ends closed to keep the foam in place, so it would look like this. I clipped the bow together with the glitter vinyl facing on the inside. Then sewed the bow pieces together. Once I flipped it right sides out, the bow looked like this. To sew the middle of the bow, I needed extra hands for this. I broke so many needles and I had to use pliers to pull the needle through. This is what the bow looked like after. And here is what the bow looks like with the 3D prints on. Moving on to the bow tails, I firstly cut out all the glitter HTV patterns I would need. I then ironed my fabric, then cut out the fabric pieces and interfacing pieces. For the bow tail insert, I chose a dark brown satin fabric and cut 4 pieces out for each pattern piece. I then ironed these for a smooth finish with no creases. I also ironed the yellow bow pieces to neaten too. I then ironed on the glitter vinyl patterns for the yellow bow tail pieces, the brown bow inserts, and the brown bow tail pieces. I then ironed on flocked velvet vinyl onto 2 of the brown bow tail inserts. I pinned the bow tail pieces together. I pinned the glitter vinyl pieces together as one piece. For the back of the bow tails, it was one big yellow piece, so I didn't need to do anything to the back side of the yellow tails. I sewed the big yellow piece and the brown piece together. Both these pieces had glitter on them. I used a brown thread for the top stitch and a yellow stitch for the bottom stitch. Next, I sewed the other yellow pieces to the brown piece. I pinned the pretty glitter front to the plain back, then sewed the entire bow tails together. I took it slow around the curves. When I got to the straight edge of the bow piece, I left an opening so I could flip the bow tail right sides out. I trimmed the curves with pinking shears and trimmed along all the curves. After bringing it right sides out, I gave it an iron and then began folding the tail pleats in place. Just look at how pretty it is turning into. It was then time to finish off the brown inserts. I sewed the brown pieces right sides together and left a gap to turn it right sides out. I used my pinking shears to trim the edges and clipped along all the curves before flipping it right sides out. I then ironed flat, then hand sewed the brown inserts closed. I clipped and hand sewed the bow tail folds in place within the layers so the stitches could not be seen. I hand sewed here at the back of the bow to secure the fold in place. I then began the long process of hand sewing clips onto the skirt layers to attach the bow, and also hand sewed a few smaller clips on the bow tails to keep them secured onto the black velvet layer. The bow and skirt parts were now all finished. This was such a massive part of the project. I was so relieved I had finally finished it, and I was so happy with how it turned out. The skirt is finally done. This was a massive project that I took, and despite all the challenges I face, I'm so happy with how everything turned out. There's always something to learn from, and I'm so happy with how much I've learnt and I've grown with this project so far. In future, I've also taken on board how I could improve, such as resin. I now know to use a heat gun while setting the resin. Even though there was a few holes in the resin pieces, I still managed to somehow work by using alcohol markers to cover up all the white dust dots. I could have been really unhappy with it, but from a distance you can't even see the white dots. Looking back at it now, I can see that it's normal making mistakes and it's normal stuffing up. I think the most important thing is not about being perfect, it's how to manage and go around the imperfections to make it something that you're happy with. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly appreciate it. A lot of work goes into making these videos, so I hope you enjoy. Part 4 is going to be an even bigger one than this. I thought this part was going to be the biggest part, but no, the next part's just as big, if not bigger. It's going to take me a while to edit, but I'll hopefully have it out in the next coming weeks. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video.
A proper send-up!